In 1962, the FDA's powers increased dramatically, and they got control over efficacy. Okay? And why was that? Why 62? What happened? Anybody? Why the big change in 62? The thalidomide disaster. That is correct. Okay? The thalidomide disaster was a drug which had not actually been approved in the United States, but it had been approved elsewhere. And it turned out that if taken at a particular point, when a woman was pregnant, it could lead to seal limb, lead to babies being born without limbs. It was a very terrible, tragic disaster, very public disaster. Okay? Well, because of this, and this is typically when the FDA gets new powers, is when you have a disaster like this, when you have a public tragedy like this. Because of this, the FDA got control over efficacy as well. So Peltzman looked at, well, what happened to the number of new drugs, okay, before 62 and after 62? What happened to the number of new drugs after it became much more expensive to get through FDA trials, FDA-required trials? And basically what he did is he first created a model of the pharmaceutical marketplace, okay, which is these red triangle, or red diamonds here, okay? And he checked using that model that he could predict the actual number of new chemical entities which were approved in the years prior to 1962. Okay? And as you see, his model predicts or tracks the actual number of approvals quite well. Okay? He then asked, well, what would have happened after 62? This is the prediction of the model, assuming nothing else had changed. This is what actually happened. Or if you like, you can simply look at the average number of new drugs, okay, approved prior to 1962 was about 40, 41 a year. Okay. In the years after 1962, it declined to about 16 a year. So we had about a 60% drop in the number of new drug approvals after 1962. A very substantial drop in the number of new drugs. So costly safety and efficacy trials can dramatically reduce the number of new drugs. I want to talk about safety and the elusive quest for safety. The hard truth is that all efficacious drugs have side effects. I know this is something you're all familiar with. And it's simply a fact that in any reasonably sized clinical trial, it is going to be very difficult to find all side effects, even major ones. So for example, suppose that we have a drug which doubles the risk from 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 1,000, doubles the risk of stroke or something serious, from 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 1,000. Now that's a serious problem in a population of 1 million when a drug is actually released onto the marketplace. But suppose you have a trial of 4,000 people, 2,000 of whom get the drug and 2,000 of whom are given placebo. It's quite possible with those small numbers that more people in the placebo group are going to have a stroke than in the treatment group. Okay? With only 4,000 people in a clinical trial, it's going to be very, very difficult to pick up an effect of a 1 in 2,000 to a 1 in 1,000, even though that's a very serious problem once the drug is approved. And 4,000 people is a very large clinical trial. That's a big clinical trial. That's an expensive multi-million-dollar clinical trial. Okay? So even in a large and expensive clinical trial, it is going to be the case, even if companies do everything right, it is going to be the case that some drugs are going to be approved which are later shown to have serious side effects. That is just a mathematical certainty, a statistical certainty. We are going to approve some drugs which have major side effects. And there's no way around that at any reasonable cost. That, in fact, is as part of the Vioxx story. Early studies showed no unusual problems with Vioxx. Evidence began to grow that there was a problem as studies accumulated. And basically the problem here was that 2 studies, each of which showed no problem, could suggest a problem when they were evaluated together in a so-called meta-analysis. And as these studies accumulated, it looked more and more like there was a problem with Vioxx. Okay. Now, it is true that larger trials for longer periods of time would discover more side effects, but clinical trials, as I've mentioned, are very expensive. And it is quite possible, indeed it is very likely, that more expensive and longer clinical trials will actually end up killing more people because fewer new drugs will be approved. So we always have to look at the trade-offs. Economists are big on trade-offs. Okay. What is the trade-off? Yes, we will have greater safety of those drugs which are approved if we lengthen clinical review times, but fewer new drugs will be approved. And it is quite possible, even likely, that the latter effect outweighs the former. I also want to put the idea of safety in perspective. Here's a little graph on HIV mortality. Okay. This is mortality rates, deaths per 100,000 population, after the new drugs were introduced in 1995. Okay. So, yes, it is true that some bad drugs are occasionally released onto the market, and indeed that is inevitable. But when we look at the pharmaceutical marketplace in total, and we ask, is this a beneficial system? It certainly is. In fact, it's been estimated that about 1/3 of the increase in life expectancy since 1960 has been due to improved pharmaceuticals alone. So about 1/3 of the total increase in life expectancy since 1960 is due to improved pharmaceuticals, especially cardiac medications have been very successful. Okay. So new drugs really can be beneficial. And that's why I, in particular, am worried about more costly clinical trials, because that's going to reduce the number of new drugs. And overall, pharmaceuticals have been really quite effective. Okay, I want to talk about some further evidence. We're going to be coming at this issue of the FDA and these trade-offs from a number of different perspectives. So I want to talk briefly, what do physicians say about the FDA? Okay. Physicians are probably more informed about the costs and benefits of the FDA than most people, than most patients. So it might be useful to just have a look at what they say.